prioritize and execute, always improve your fighting position, exploit all technical and tactical advantages, push situational awareness up and down the chain. Like those things that have been when the SEAL teams are passed on to me and a part of me and therefore a part of my protagonist, I put those in italics in the novel.
Welcome to Successful Living with Bill Knapik. Every week, we talk with interesting people in a variety of professions for ideas to enhance your success in all aspects of life. Successful Living with Bill Knapik starts right now. Here's Bill Knapik.
Welcome to the show. It is Successful Living with Bill Knapik, and today an extra special guest as we welcome Jack Carr. Oh yeah, he is the author of The Terminal List, True Believer, Savage Son, The Devil's Hand, and his newest book is Only the Dead. And of course, The Terminal List has been adapted to the Amazon series that you may have already seen, starring Chris Pratt. Jack has served our country as a Navy SEAL, in fact, as a Navy SEAL sniper. So let's get down to business as we welcome Jack Carr. Jack, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. Only the Dead is the latest one. And it comes out here on May 16th.
Only the Dead. Number one, thank you and any person serving or veteran listening for your service. We appreciate it so much.
Well, thank you so much for that support. That's sincerely appreciated.
And one of the things, let's first, if we would, talk about how you got started. And I suppose I've discovered you on YouTube. You have a podcast, and of course the series on Amazon. But give us an idea as far as writing and books, how they influenced you before you became a Navy SEAL.
Oh yeah, it's my mom was a librarian and still is. So I grew up surrounded by books and a love of reading, and reading was just a natural part of my life for as long as I can remember. It wasn't something that my parents had to force upon me. It was just something that was a natural part of my life. And very early on, I was fifth grade, age 10. That's when I started making that transition from young adult literature to the same kind of thrillers that my parents were reading. That's when Hunt for Red October came out. And certainly by sixth grade, by age 11, I was reading those same kinds of thrillers that my parents were reading. Nelson DeMille and David Morrell, Tom Clancy, A.J. Quinnell, J. Pollock, Mark Holden, Louis L'Amour, Stephen Hunter, all these amazing authors who were masters in the art of storytelling. And what they were doing, essentially, was giving me an early education in the art of storytelling from those masters. Read all those books very early on. I never stopped. And I got to read them also at a time when I'm age 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And it was just pure magic, the pages of those books. So I knew that one day after my time in the military, I'd write those kinds of thrillers. And that's what I'm doing today.
Well, as far as learning how to write, did you absorb the information and the stylings and the things that these great authors were using? But how did you learn how to write so well? Because, I mean, when I listened to The Terminal List in an audio version, I could not stop. The story as it unfolds is done so well. You are so gifted at creating the story and for the reader to want to know what's going to happen next.
Thank you. I mean, it comes from the fan perspective. People that are familiar with film know that Quentin Tarantino didn't go to film school, and that's very similar to how I came to writing. It's from the fan perspective. So I knew what I liked, I knew what I didn't, I knew what worked when books that I had read were adapted to film and television. I was very aware that First Blood by David Morrell, written in 1972, that introduced the world to Rambo, Stallone film in the early 80s. Both fantastic. So I was absorbing, I was learning, and my mom introduced me to Joseph Campbell through a series of interviews that he did with Bill Moyers back in 1988 called The Power of Myth. So I read Hero with a Thousand Faces very early, and I think I applied it to everything that I read or watched after. So, of course, Joseph Campbell studied mythologies, different cultures having very similar mythologies, even though they had no touch points with each other back to the beginning of time. And there's certain elements that were similar that are in my stories as well. But all that came from such a pure place. It didn't come from waking up one morning at age 40, 45, whatever it was, and say, oh, I should give this writing thing a try. What should I have been reading for the past 35 or 40 years? No, I'd already laid that foundation through reading very early on. And I was also studying warfare very early on, and that's never stopped as well. So the academic study of insurgencies and counterinsurgencies and terrorism and special operations, and then the practical application of that downrange in Iraq and Afghanistan as a SEAL. So the reading that I'd done, the academic study of warfare, the practical experience on the battlefield, all came together at the right time and place as I was getting out of the military, and all went into the pages of that first novel, and that continues on through this latest one, Only the Dead.
As you were serving as a Navy SEAL, were you also taking notes? Did you have a journal and write about certain things and say, "Hey, I'm going to use this later. Or I'm going to remember this later," and who knows what's going to happen? Did you know when you were a SEAL that you're going to write a book?
Well, I knew that I was going to write after my time in the SEAL team, but while I was in, I was not actively writing or thinking about storylines or anything like that. I was solely focused on the task at hand and solely focused on being the best operator and best leader that I could possibly be, and always improving at both of those things. And that's what I thought I owed the families of the people I was taking downrange, the people to my right and left on the battlefield, the mission, the country, the team. So I was solely focused on those things. I was still reading, but still as a fan. And I only thought about actual storylines when I got back from my final deployment, took a breath, look around, realized that my family needed me and I was going to get out because that last deployment would be the last one where I would tactically maneuver guys on the battlefield again. And that was what I came in to do. And if you stay in the SEAL teams after a certain time, or the military after a certain amount of time, you're going to be more of a manager. So I've come back as a commanding officer of a SEAL team, and which sounds impressive, but you're really back in the tactical operations center, allocating assets and that sort of a thing. You're not out there actively with the guys kicking in the doors, doing the job. So I had a couple years left in the SEAL teams, and I was an operations officer, which for those listening is like a COO of a company, managing kind of day-to-day operations of our training command. So had a little time on my hands, and I had a lot of time on my hands when I dropped my papers to get out of the military, because once you do that, you go in a separate pile, and your job essentially becomes to get out of this gigantic bureaucracy. And you're going to dental, and you're going to medical, and you're going to get read out of secret programs, and you're turning in gear and all that sort of a thing. And you're also making appointments for these things, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that you also stand in line to make those appointments. So you have a lot of time on your hands that you didn't have previously. So that's when I started writing, and I wrote down about 6, 7, 8, 9 different ideas, one-page executive summaries, and it was very clear to me that the one to start with was the terminal list. That was the hardest hitting out of the gate, the most visceral, the most primal, and I got to work.
It's totally those that are listening and have read or heard and certainly seen the series on Amazon. It is incredible, but I could not take my attention away from the terminal list. When you developed the terminal list, did you know it was going to be a series, or did you say, "Hey, I'm going to write one book"?
I knew it was going to be a series from the outset, and I started writing the second book in the series, True Believer, before I'd even turned in the first novel, The Simon & Schuster. I didn't even have really a connection there yet. And I always thought about that story about John Grisham writing A Time to Kill first and not being able to give that book away, and then writing The Firm. And of course, then Tom Cruise stars in the movie, and we've had a John Grisham novel every year since. But if he'd stopped at A Time to Kill, maybe we wouldn't have had the Firm, and we wouldn't have Pelican Brief, and we wouldn't have had all those books and films. So I always thought about that. I thought I'm always going to write 2, and if both of them don't work, then I'm going to reevaluate some life choices or go to some contingency planning. But I was already on a plane to Mozambique to do research for my second novel right after I got out of the SEAL teams and before I'd sent that first book to Simon & Schuster. So I always knew that it was going to be a series from the get-go.
Well, I want to advance ahead a question I was going to ask later, and that is, as you love books and as you consume, you're writing as an author, of course, but as you consume books and stories, how do you do it? Do you read a book, the physical book? Do you use a device, or do you listen to the books?
Oh, I read. I'm definitely a physical book reader. I think I do too much work on an actual computer to then be able to enjoy something through that same medium. And for whatever reason, I also kind of missed the audiobook type of a craze. So I know it's the fastest growing segment in publishing, and I am so fortunate to have Ray Porter as my narrator. Just incredible. That first book was up for audiobook of the year. So we got to go to New York and put on the tuxes and hang out together and have a few drinks. And it was up there. My first novel with Stephen King and Ruth Ware.
Wow.
So the audiobook is just amazing, and people love the audiobook. And that's all due to Ray Porter being just Shakespearean trained actor, top of his game, amazing guy. But personally, I read. I have a physical book and I read. That's the way that I was brought up, and that's the way that I consume these types of books.
I totally agree. Ray Porter is incredible, and I've listened to 3 of the books so far. So
all right.
We're talking with Jack Carr, author of The Terminal List. His latest book is Only the Dead. I have it right here on my desk. But let's advance ahead just a bit, Jack, and go back. And that is, let's tell people all the things you're doing in case they don't know. Yes, you're a super author. All the other things you're doing. This is your 6th book, but let's tell people about the podcast and all the other things that you have in play. You have things on your website, officialjackcarr.com. You have a store with all kinds of great things, but tell them about the podcast too.
Right. So as I started down this path, initially just having grown up really in the 80s, I thought that you could be an author in a cabin on the mountains and write a book, send it to New York, maybe do one interview and then start writing again. Yeah. And that was very appealing to me. Now, as I crept up on publication of that first novel back in March of 2018, it became very readily apparent that there was more to it than that, especially today. And authors that didn't have to go out there or capitalize on any of the platforms that are available now that weren't available 30, 40 years ago were the outliers. And I started looking at this as an entrepreneurial type venture where the product, in this case, a book, has to be the best that it can possibly be. But then people have to know it exists. And how do you do that? Well, these days you can take ownership of a lot of this, and you can engage with readers on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, through a website and a newsletter and a blog that I update, through merchandise, through a podcast. And so the podcast came about from getting so many questions on social media that didn't really lend themselves to a one sentence answer. And I thought, well, you know what, I'll do a podcast. It's a better way through conversation to discuss these different issues that people seem to be asking me about. And I heard other people, podcasters, say there are no barriers to entry on podcasting and that sort of a thing. So I gave it a shot and I recorded a couple episodes, and I realized also very quickly that the other side of it, the production side of it, well, that's where my skill set ends. Uploading things and the graphics and all the rest of it. Right. So anyway, I got a podcast production company that does that now, and I have the Danger Close podcast where I bring on all sorts of guests to discuss all sorts of issues, to include authors and books. And it's a lot more work than I thought. I've read every book from every guest thus far and come up with all the questions. And what's been great about it is that a lot of those books I probably would have prioritized a little lower because there are so many things going on. So I would have looked at, a 5-meter target, so a closer target, and I'm like, oh, that takes priority right now. But because I have a guest coming on the podcast, I have to read their book. So I did. And a lot of what I've learned has actually made it into my novels. So there's a lot of overlap between all these things. And I love doing the podcast. I love engaging with people on social media. I try to add value to people's lives throughout the year. And just like with every book that I write, people are trusting me with their time, and they're never going to get that time back. So that's something I take extremely seriously. So as much thought goes into any sentence in the book as goes into any tweet or any post on Instagram or any blog post or any question for a guest on my podcast. And I sincerely appreciate everyone who has joined me on this journey.
And I've listened to several podcasts, just recently the one where it's a several part where you talked, I forget the person's name, but he was on the raid for Osama bin Laden, the head of the snake, I think it was called. And
yep.
I mean,
that
is so,
Mark Owen.
He was so great, and to hear that, you're right there with it. And as you talked to him, it was really incredible. And as you're talking about social media and the things that you do as an author here today, 2023, it's not that you're just doing them to do them, to market and those things. You sunk your teeth into them and you enjoy it because it comes across and it pulls people in.
Oh, fantastic. And those history posts that I do post primarily about terrorism or about authors who have influenced me along my journey as well. So I talk about those things. But I have my first nonfiction work that's coming out in a year and a half, and it's on the Beirut barracks bombing, 1983 in Beirut, Lebanon. And I'm working on that with a historian and Pulitzer Prize finalist James Scott, who writes primarily about World War II. But we're doing this together, and that'll come out in a year and a half. And that's my first venture into the nonfiction world. So there's a lot going on, that plus the scripts for the series and all sorts of things. So I feel extremely fortunate to have a full dance card.
You most certainly do. And speaking of the series, I just saw also on YouTube your interview with Chris Pratt. It was interesting to hear his story as he was trying to become an actor. And, you know, we see these successful actors and you're thinking, how did they get there? His was pretty interesting, and he just followed along with what life was delivering to him at the time. That was fascinating.
Oh yeah, walking over at Bubba Gump's Shrimp Company in Maui, and walking over, saw an actress, director, producer, and walked over, introduced himself, and she asked, "Are you an actor?" And he said, "Yes, I am."
Right.
And, so off he went to the races. Although it took a little while before he became Star-Lord, and people kind of just look at Jurassic World and Guardians of the Galaxy and those A-list roles, but he had a path to get there, certainly, and he's such a great guy and absolutely perfect for this role, and the only person I wanted to play it from the very beginning, from the first sentence I wrote back in December of 2014. I picked Chris Pratt, picked Antoine Fuqua, picked Emily Bessler as my editor at Simon & Schuster, although none of them knew who I was at the time, and now we're a team.
There's the sniper skills. You set your target and accomplish the mission. No doubt about it. So we'll ask here, the Terminal List, will that continue on Amazon? Are you going to have another bunch of shows?
Yep. So we've announced thus far. It's True Believer, my second book, will be. And things can always go off the rails. You know, I always like to mention that because you never know how things are going to go. But we are working on scripts for a spin-off series first on a character called Ben Edwards, played by Taylor Kitsch. A prequel origin story for him that's more of an international espionage thriller. And I'm writing one of those episodes, writing the finale. And then we'll roll right from that into True Believer starring Chris Pratt. So it's busy times, but there's a writer's strike in Hollywood right now, so it's pencils down on that. So when that happens, you just adapt. And now I shift back into book 7 fully. And then when the writer's strike's over, we'll get back to work on those scripts.
Well, I had Nelson DeMille on the show a while ago, and you probably heard what he does. I'll ask you the same thing, and that is when
number 2 pencil, or number 1 pencil, whatever he is.
I think it was the number 2 pencil, but he has his writing area called Area 51 or whatever it's called. But he goes into a room and writes. So my question is, when you write, do you have a place you go? Do you have a certain time of the day that you go? How do you write your books?
We've moved a couple times here. While I was writing that first one, I was in my final year in the SEAL team. So that one was primarily written between 10 at night and 2 or 3 in the morning in a little office off our bedroom in a house we rented in Coronado, California, when I was in the SEAL teams. Then we moved up here to Park City, Utah, and I started writing. I thought I was going to have a nice little room in our house that was quiet, and realized very quickly that as soon as you close doors, in an home office, and you have children, it's like a magnet. And that's the time when everyone wants to talk to you, when you close those doors to work. So I started working at the local library and going into the little study rooms that they have there. So I did that for books 2, 3, and 4. And then we moved again and started renting Airbnbs around Park City. So found a great little cabin. So I worked on the last book primarily in that cabin. And then for this one, I thought I was going to do the same thing and went back there. It just didn't feel right for whatever reason. So came back home and we moved we finally found a nice spot that's a little more isolated, kind of outside of town. And there's a room here that is just dedicated to writing, to nothing else. So I have a room for writing. I have another area that I'm in right now that's my office for all the business side of things. So that's kind of how it's morphed over the last few years. But the most important thing for me anyway is just having uninterrupted time. I don't need a beautiful view. I don't need anything like that. I just need quiet, and I need uninterrupted time. And that is the most important part for me when it comes to writing.
Focus. Well, what I did as far as reading your books via audio, I started with Terminal List, then went to True Believer and did something that I guess you're not supposed to do. I skipped over to In the Blood. And now my plan is to read the new book, Only the Dead, which you're going to be here in Houston promoting very soon, May 17th. And then I'm going to go back to Savage Son and in the Devil's Hand. So I don't know if I don't know if that's legal, but that's that's my plan.
I believe it's legal, but there's been a lot of changes in the law lately, so you might want to check local ordinances. But I would right now. I think if I was to do my informal polling, I think that people's favorites are Savage Son and In the Blood. Those are the kind of tied for people's favorites. But we'll see. We'll see if those get dethroned with Only the Dead here. And this one is the longest so far, that's for sure. It's about 139,000 words, and it is the most brutal to date as well.
More brutal than the Terminal List.
More brutal than any of them thus far. Yeah, it didn't start out that way. It just, ahead of time, I didn't say, I'm going to write the most brutal novel yet. It just naturally happened that way.
Well, also, the computer. Now, I forget if it was In the Blood or True Believer, but the computer Alice, and to call it a computer would be to insult Alice because she is so
careful.
You
don't want to do that.
In fact, she is probably on top of us right now. But in the meantime, how cool was that to have the character, to have that piece, Alice, as part of the story? How did you think of that?
Well, I did research and I talked to same thing with the Devil's Hand. I had no touch points while I was in the military on bioweapons research or what they call biodefense research. So I had to go deep down the rabbit hole on that for the Devil's Hand. And then for In the Blood, I had no touch points with quantum computing and artificial intelligence. So I had to go deep down the rabbit hole there as well and talk to different people who had worked in that area of defense. And when you talk to people who have had spent time doing that kind of research and development, they're very secretive. But if you talk to enough of them, they all leave something out. So this was where I got to be kind of an investigative journalist. You interview so many people, they all give you little hints, a tiny little bit, but they all give you different things. So once you get all those different parts, you kind of start putting this puzzle together. And then you do, of course, do research in books and journals and online and all that. But you put together the best picture you can based off the information available and what you've been able to garner. And I had, after that book was published, I had a few people that worked in that space call me and say that I got very close. And what was also interesting, most everyone that I talked to and interviewed about quantum computing and artificial intelligence from the defense side of the house, they said they would tell me more, but it would put my book into the science fiction section. So that was probably the scariest few chapters I've ever written, because I would be shocked if I was very far off, if the place that I describe in San Antonio isn't almost exactly the way I describe it.
Well, what I couldn't believe was, or I found it interesting, that once James Reese got the information he needed from Alice, he just left and went there. And I'm thinking, hey, I think I'd stay around a little while to learn a bit more. But he went right on target to take care of what he was after at the time.
Oh yeah. You got to move that story forward. Got to keep going.
Indeed. Fascinating stuff. As far as, let's tell people again about the podcast. They can go to YouTube, Danger Close. It's right there.
Yep.
And the episodes, and the beauty of the episodes is they're voluminous. You get in depth with your guests there, sometimes for an hour and a half plus even.
Yep. There's a lot of them that go 2 hours, some 3. The one you talked about, that the head of the snake with Mark Owen, who was on the Bin Laden raid, had to go into 4 different episodes just to break it up a little bit. But yeah, it's called Danger Close Podcast, and there's an Instagram, Danger Close, as well. And it's on my YouTube channel, which is Jack Carr USA. And that's all up there. And I really, really enjoy it. Just, what I really like is that I turn off the phone, turn off the computer. Very few things are beeping at me, and you have a solid hour, 2 hours just to get to know somebody. Or if you already know them, you get to learn new things about them. So it's fascinating for me. And it's, once again, it's something that wasn't available for authors in 1985, 1995, sure, 1975. But it is available today. And in a time when authenticity really reigns supreme and people want to know who's behind whatever product they're buying or they're engaging with. So such another way for people not just to get to know my guests, but to get to know me a little bit as well.
Also, they get to know you in another way with each of your books. And in fact, as I'm listening on the audio, I go back and replay it. Those are the preface. When you do the preface of the book, it gives us insight into your insights into the world as it is at the time you're writing it. But I find the preface to be really great. And again, I consume it twice at least, and then I go on to the book. But that is a great book.
People really enjoy the preface. I get a lot of comments about those because they're also so personal. So I set up the book in that preface and kind of give a little bit about the why behind what I'm writing about. And then I started writing an author's note at the end as well. And I started that with The Devil's Hand just because there was so much research that went into that bio weapons side of the house. And so I did that also for the last book, for In the Blood. And I did it for this book as well, Only the Dead. And in the author's note at the end, I talk about what was truth and what was fiction. So when people get to the end of that book, they don't have to wonder what was real and what wasn't. I discuss that in the author's note, and I enjoy doing that. I think I'll continue doing that going forward.
Exactly. In the Blood, I remember hearing that. It was incredible. We're talking with author Jack Carr, Navy SEAL. Now, Jack, what's the appropriate thing? You're not in the SEALs now, but are you always a SEAL? Is that how it works?
Well, we don't get as excited about it as Marines do.
Okay.
So I agree. It's very confusing with Marines. Actually, we're outlined into one of my novels. Former Navy SEAL is just fine.
Former Navy SEAL and former Navy SEAL sniper. So wherever you're listening, check him out as he's presenting his new book, Only the Dead. Go to his website. We're going to take a quick break, come right back with Jack Carr. Stay with us. As we continue, that's right, the one and only author, former Navy SEAL, Jack Carr is with us. So you tuned into a great show if you're listening at the time of broadcast, or if you're on the internet, it is super awesome. Here he is, Jack Carr. Jack, welcome back as we continue. The books are incredible. Well, one of the things that I think, and again, I've consumed 3 of the books, I like so many things, but one of the things I think is interesting is the detail, your experience, especially when you talk about the sniper elements, when there's sniper work being done, when there's gear, when he's getting his gear ready. That's always fun at the various points of the books. And then the other thing is you bring forth, I guess there's Navy SEAL sayings, but one I like is the only easy day was yesterday.
Yep.
And then the other one, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Did I get that right?
You got it right. That's the one.
Did they originate in the SEALs?
They did. Only easy day was yesterday is on a sign, or it used to be anyway, on what we call the grinder, which is an area in the BUDS compound, the SEAL training compound, where you do your physical training. And you see that every day. The only easy day was yesterday. And then the slow, smooth is fast. I think the first time we hear that in BUDS training was back in 3rd phase when they start teaching you the weapons. So 1st phase is really just to see who can make it. That's when that Hell Week comes in. People may have seen that on Discovery Channel or other places.
Sure.
Where you're up for the entire week and running around with a boat on your head and doing the obstacle course and swims and all sorts of things. So 1st phase is just to make sure that you're tough enough to be there, essentially. 2nd phase is all about diving, making sure you're comfortable in the water. And 3rd phase is making sure that you are safe with weapons and explosives. So I think the first time we hear it is in 3rd phase, and I may have a little conflation in my memory going on, but that's how I remember it anyway. And seems to make sense because you do talk about that a lot as you're doing weapons transitions between, let's say, an M4 and a pistol or whatever else. But slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
And those are great things that help all of us in anything we do in life. That's just great advice and things I think to keep mindful of.
And I typically put those things in italics. So if people are reading along and all of a sudden my protagonist thinks of something in italics that sounds like one of these sayings, 2 is 1, 1 is none, prioritize and execute, always improve your fighting position, exploit all technical and tactical advantages, push situational awareness up and down the chain. Like those things that have been when the SEAL teams are passed on to me and a part of me and therefore a part of my protagonist, I put those in italics in the novel.
Going back to the Terminal List, when you started and created, how was the character James Reese created? Is that you?
Well, he's a lot faster than I am, a lot better shot than I ever was. He does drive a Land Cruiser like I do, and 1988 FJ62 Land Cruiser. He was a former Navy SEAL sniper, which I was, became an officer, and then eventually a troop commander, like I did. But that's pretty much where the similarities end, and he gets thrown into a completely fictional narrative. And that first book unravels a conspiracy that takes out his troop and his family, and then he essentially becomes the insurgent, becomes the terrorist that he'd been fighting for the last, at that time, 16, 17 years at war, adopting those tactics of the enemy. And even deeper than that, it's really about someone who is bringing the wars from Iraq and Afghanistan home to the front doorsteps of people who have been sending young men and women to their deaths for, at that time, 16, 17 years. So there's a few different levels as far as how deep you want to think about it.
I think one of the things we enjoy and maybe yourself, as we watch movies, I also thought in Terminal List a slight comparison to Death Wish, Charles Bronson, on a different level, totally different, but I did think of Death Wish. But one of the things I think about, even if it's James Bond, we look at the characters and books and things we consume, movies, and we admire qualities about them. James Reese, in your books, he's tough. He's resilient. He's smart. He's a survivor. He's a planner. He goes and gets his target, but he's not just tough in terms of physically to be able to do all the stuff he does, but his mind. And I think, I'm guessing you brought that forth in SEAL training and your role as a Navy SEAL in real life, that the mind plays such a big part in being successful and being tough.
Oh yeah, I think any average high school athlete can physically make it through SEAL training. That's really not what it's about. But it's really about that mental fortitude, that grit, which is an intangible type of a thing. How do you test for grit? Well, you put someone through a crucible, and I think that's why young men in particular have gravitated towards things like Marine Corps boot camp, towards BUDS training in the SEAL teams, toward Ranger School in the Army, or the Q course for Army Special Forces, but some sort of a test, because that used to be a part of society, meaning a young man would have to go through some sort of a crucible to prove himself before he was accepted into the tribe, into that society. And it's kind of gone by the wayside in modern times, but I think it's still there. I think it's still in our DNA. It's somewhere buried. People have the desire to test themselves. And so in SEAL training in particular, it is all about that mental fortitude, mental toughness, that grit, that resiliency, but also a few other things, that moral courage, that physical courage, and something called team ability, which is not a real word, so we had to make it up in the SEAL teams, meaning that you're going to be you're going to add value to that team in a way that moves the ball forward. And so those are the things we're looking for, and those are the things that James Reese embodies.
And that's right. It's not just the individual. You're working as a team, and that's a whole nother art form.
Oh, yeah. And I talk about that in the first book. It's kind of the first time that James Reese he doesn't have his team there. He doesn't have his support network. But he has a couple friends that come in, Liz Riley, Ben Edwards, and they form this team in that first novel. And that carries over into some of the other ones as well, particularly Savage Son, where he gets a team together. But I like juxtaposing that team dynamic with James Reese having to go off and do things on his own, because that's not what he was doing in the SEAL teams for all the years that he was operating in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many times in these novels, now he is on his own. So there's some things that he is good at, some things that he is not. Just like in the team, you have some things that you are good at, and you have specialties. You have somebody who's a breacher, who is the expert in explosives. You have the sniper. You have the person who's the expert in air operations. You have the person that's the expert in diving or navigation, whatever it might be. And you know all these things, but some people are naturally better at it than others, or some people have been sent to multiple schools in order to be a subject matter expert there. So I like to juxtapose those two things, the team element versus James Reese on his own throughout the novels.
In one of the books, you mentioned the difference between a marksman and a sniper. What was that?
Well, I don't know if I go into complete detail in that, but a sniper is the next level up. And you can have a designated marksman who has maybe gone to a next level up school in the military. But a sniper is going to be someone who is really thinking about that long range dance of death, not just the shooting part, but everything else that goes into that, the observation and the stalking and the studying of the enemy and learning that pattern of life of that enemy, working alone, working with a spotter, or working with a team in like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan for a lot of it, because that model had changed a little bit from the Vietnam days of going off into the jungle with just two guys, a sniper and a spotter. Well, now you can bring an automatic weapons person along just in case you get contacted by the enemy who's holding security for you. So you move and you adapt to a changing environment. So that sniper is not just going to be the best that he can possibly be with a sniper weapon system, but he's also going to learn how to essentially adapt to his environment, whether that's the mountains, whether that's a jungle, whether that's the desert, whether that's an urban environment. And he's going to learn how to stalk, and he's going to learn how to study a pattern of life of his prey, and until you meet at that one time and place where it's the right time to press the trigger.
In fact, patience is also a big part of that, as I understand from the books.
That's right.
Why did you choose to be a sniper?
I always wanted, since I was a little kid, I always knew I was going to serve in the military. My grandfather was killed in World War II, so I grew up with, he was a Marine Corsair pilot, which is the plane that had the gull wings that would fold up until you could fit them on aircraft carriers. So I grew up with his medals and his wings and pictures of him and his squadron. So I always knew I was going to go into the military. And then I found out what SEALs were at age 7. So at the ripe old age of 7, I decided I would become a SEAL, and that's the way I was going to serve my country in uniform. And then somewhere along the line, I started learning more about snipers. And certainly by the time I was in high school, or maybe it was even in junior high, reading the Charles Henderson book, Marine Sniper, about Carlos Hathcock, I was in, and I knew that would be something that I wanted to do. And that's one of the reasons that I went in and enlisted instead of as an officer, because I knew that officers typically weren't snipers. And I really wanted to go to sniper school. I wanted to see if I could pass, and then I wanted to do the job. And again, now I bring that experience into the pages of these novels, not just the technical side, because anybody can really get online and look that stuff up or conduct an interview and get that sort of thing out of an interview with someone who knows what they're doing. But really the feelings and emotions behind what it feels like to press the trigger and do that job. I take those and I apply those to a completely fictional narrative. So if someone's reading the book and the feelings and emotions that James Reese is experiencing seem real, it's because all of those come from a real place, and they come right from my heart and soul and go directly onto the page.
The emotions are a big part of it, and I'm going to guess that's why you draw people into your books. And the very first part, my discovery in the terminal list, let's just say it was a great move to include a sniper scene at the beginning. That drew me in right away.
I love it. Nice.
You know what I'm saying? It was so cool because right off the bat, Jack, you're bringing people into it, and they're James Reese at that moment, looking down at the car, at the guy, and it's like, oh. So well done. You hear that a lot, I know, but I love that part, and of course all the parts of the book. The other thing, just skipping around here a little bit, one of the things, okay, I think it was episode 6 in the series, that one was a very, if I have the episodes right, that one was one that was very dirty. I mean, the scene, the environment, there's a lot of dirt, and it made me think of how they filmed that when they did that particular episode. You know which one I'm talking about?
I sure do. So that's the
Were you there, by the way?
The First Blood tribute episode, and I was not there for that episode. I was there for multiple episodes, and I have a little cameo in episode 3 where I get in a gunfight with Chris Pratt, and that was amazing to see how they do that, how they film that sort of thing. But episode 6 was was written by Max Adams, former Army Ranger, amazing guy, incredible writer, and that was the First Blood tribute episode. And it was a physically demanding one for both Chris Pratt and his stunt double, because there's not a lot of green screen stuff going on in this.
So
This
that
is
was
a very
real.
physical role. And having that stuntman jump off the top of this hillside essentially and take this fall was pretty impressive. There's a great photo that I have on my Instagram, and that Chris Romrell, who's Chris's stunt double, has on his Instagram that shows him jumping off that very steep hillside, and it looks like he's flying. But yeah, that was a dirty episode, and certainly was physically demanding for cast and crew.
Well, the other thing I want to ask about, as far as the dirt and the environment that's in war or in anything like this, we see in movies, we see people with guns, rifles, pistols, and it's raining. They're coming out of the water. I mean, guns don't work in the water, or do they?
Oh yeah, they can. They can also get fouled, particularly in seawater when you're getting tumbled in the surf zone and onto a beach, that sort of a thing. So when I first got to the SEAL teams, we typically used M14s and even wheel guns, so revolvers, Smith & Wesson 686s coming out of the water, because they were less apt to foul, just less moving parts than in, say, an auto-loading pistol or an auto-loading rifle, like an M4. But now, when I left the teams anyway, we had these shoot-through bags. So you have these bags that they were some sort of thick neoprene with plastic, so you could actually use your sights, that sort of a thing, and they were shoot-through bags. So as long as you didn't shoot, they were still good to go, which meant that as you come out of the water, there's no water and sand in it yet, so you can actually come out of the water. And if you don't get in a gunfight, you move up across the beach or the rocks or whatever you're doing, take it out of that bag and continue on mission. But if you're coming out of the water and need to shoot to get back in the water to extract, well, then you can shoot through this waterproof bag, and it's built like a glove around the handle of your rifle, so that thing is gonna work and not be fouled by sand when you need it.
Well, the other thing I'm thinking about, True Believer, the part where he takes a shower. That reminded me, we had Chris Hadfield on the show years ago, the astronaut, former commander of the space station. And when Chris was on, I asked him, when you were in space, he served 161 days in space on 3 missions. And I said, when you came back from space, what was the one thing you wanted to do the most? And I'm thinking, have a steak dinner or whatever your favorite food is. He says to take a shower after being his.
Yeah, he's probably using like sponge baths or something up there. I
Right.
don't even know.
So when I saw James Reese, when he took that shower, it was so great. I thought, hey, there's something about that shower.
Yeah, well, anybody that goes into the backcountry and is spending time outside multiple days, living in the cold, living in the elements, when you come back and take a warm shower, you appreciate it just a little bit more.
No doubt. So, Jack, we have, 9 minutes or so, but I want to make sure we cover anything you want people to know. You were in Coronado, California, and of course, I haven't been there lately, but one of my favorite vacation spots was Dana Point, California. Super weather, no doubt. How did you pick Park City, Utah?
Well, during those last couple of years in the military, I built up a lot of leave, just because I was so focused on the training and the mission, and built up a ton of leave. And so when I made the decision to get out, it was also time to start using that leave. So we started skiing as a family. The kids were at that age where we could get them out on the mountain, and just found it was easier to fly to Salt Lake and drive to Park City than it was to drive anywhere in California from San Diego, because no matter where you're driving in Southern California or in California to get to the mountains, for us, we were passing through San Diego traffic, Riverside traffic, Orange County traffic, LA traffic, whatever it was, wherever you were going, whether it was Big Bear, Mammoth, or Tahoe, you're going to hit a few different bands of traffic on that route. So just zipping over the bridge to San Diego International Airport, jumping on a flight up here, that was the most efficient way to get on the hill. And then we just looked around and said, you know what? Let's raise our kids in a ski town. Let's raise our kids in the mountains. And also, I thought it was healthy to make a physical and psychological break with the military. I'd seen a lot of people have a hard time making that transition from special operations to the private sector. And I thought, you know what? A physical and psychological break would probably be the best way to go. And I think it was for us and our family anyway.
Now, when you mentioned earlier, a minute or so ago, about those that have taken a risk on you when you started out, I think that if I read that first 2 chapters there's not much risk there. You're pulled
Well,
in
thank you.
right
Too kind,
away.
too kind. Thank you.
And I would put my money on that so-called risk any day had I read that early on and been even an investor or so. So
I appreciate that.
well, last couple minutes, Jack, what do you want people to know? We're talking with Jack Carr. His newest book, it's going to be available by the time you hear this, Only the Dead, book number 6, with James Reese as a character. Started with The Terminal List. Apparently you're still working on book number 7, but that's another day. But in the meantime, what else do you want people to know, Jack?
Well, they can find me at officialjackcarr.com, officialjackcarr.com. I try to update the blog fairly frequently on there. I get a lot of questions about reading recommendations, so I have a reading list section of the website, the blog section, a merch section under shop up there where I have some interesting stuff, a lot of whiskey things up there for glasses and coasters and that sort of things for the whiskey aficionados among us. I have the podcast going, Danger Close Podcast. Try to engage as much as I possibly can on Instagram and on Twitter, and working on this new nonfiction book that comes out in a year and a half on the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing. So working on that as well as the scripts for the show as soon as the writer's strike stops, and just love creating and writing these stories. So more than anything, I just want to thank people who have supported me at all stages of this journey. It's something I think about every day, and is sincerely appreciated.
I want to say you're an inspiring individual through your books and through all the other ways people can see you. One of the things I saw too, yes, you're a sniper, you know firearms, no doubt. You're a great shot. However, I want to say I saw one of the things on YouTube where it was a CBS interview you did, and you know what I'm going to say, I think. You had the archery. I guess you're in archery as well. You hit that GoPro camera from really far away. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I have a 3D archery course out here, about 22 different targets at different ranges and angles. And CBS was out here doing a piece for CBS this morning, and they wanted to shoot a little archery. So I went out there and started shooting a little bit. And Jeff Glor, the host, said, "Hey, can you hit that GoPro?" And I just drew back, let it fly. First shot, hit that GoPro, took that thing out. That was a lot of fun. So I'm glad that I didn't think about it too much, because he just said, "Can you do that?" And I just did it without really thinking, "Oh, geez, they're filming right now. If I miss it, how are we going to deal with that? What if it takes me 5 times to hit this thing? Well, we have to say that. That's not going to look good." So I just let that thing fly, and luckily hit that on the first shot. So that was fun.
How far away was that little camera?
Oh,
do you remember?
I'm going to go with 50, because that's what someone told me the other day in an interview, and I said, let's go with that. So let's just say it's about 50 yards.
Okay, so tell us this. I know it's very complicated, but give us a word. I was just at the shooting range yesterday, in fact. So tell us one or two things that we should know if we are shooting at a target, whether we have a gun and we're, 10 yards or 5 yards. Let's keep it simple. We have a gun, a rifle, a bow and arrow. What is the thing to keep in mind to hit the target? If there's one thing.
I'd say front sight focus, but add a little front sight focus on there, along with an even press to the rear. And so with a trigger press, that's a press back, obviously, with your trigger finger. And with archery, it depends on what kind of a mechanism you're using as your trigger. But I use a thumb release, so it's really thumb on that trigger. And I think about a nice even pull back with my back, which allows that bow to fire essentially as naturally as possible. So I'd say front sight focus and a nice, even, steady trigger press to the rear.
So you enjoy archery?
Oh, yes. Since I was a little kid. One of my gifts to myself when I graduated SEAL training buds was a new bow from Performance Archery in San Diego there. Bob Frome is the owner. And I still have that bow today. I have a few bows today, actually.
Well,
but I love it.
Okay, you're doing so much, Jack. We're talking with Jack Carr. His newest book is Only the Dead. Started with The Terminal List. This is book number 6. Jack, you're so busy in the world of the business, the character, all the things, the Amazon series. Do you relax when you're not doing this? I mean, what do you do?
Every morning feel like I'm shot out of a cannon. My wife feels the same way.
Right.
We have 3 kids, dog. Kids are 17, 15, and 12. Our middle one has severe special needs, meaning he needs 24/7 full-time care forever. So we're juggling all of that. So it's busy around here just with life in general, and then figuring out a way to most effectively and efficiently incorporate all the other things that I'm doing and what I love to do, which is reading and writing. I love it. I love it. I love being so busy, but there's not much time to relax. I'll say that. Almost zero time to relax. And that's just where we find ourselves these days. But I feel extremely fortunate that I'm doing something that I love so much.
You love, right? Like I heard John Maxwell say, it's not work unless you'd rather be doing something else. Sounds like you're doing what you are designed to do, what you were put on this earth to do. And I would say once again, for all veterans listening, first responders, and for you, Jack, thank you so much for your service to protect our country. And even as you are out of the service now, I know there's no doubt you're inspiring those that are serving right now, and maybe even inspiring those to be a part of the military as they read your books, as they get to know you on YouTube, on your podcast, and all those things. So it's my hat's off, and I'm glad I discovered you on YouTube. That's how it started for me.
Interesting.
Just a few weeks ago. So.
Oh, really? Wow. Amazing.
Exactly. If you're listening on the internet, you can find Jack at all these other places on his website, officialjackcarr.com.
Just thank you so much for all the support. It is sincerely appreciated, and I'm looking forward to seeing everybody. Let's do it.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Jack Carr.
Bill Knapik has produced another show, Successful Living with Bill Knapik, one of the most unique programs of its kind. Sundays from 6 to 7 p.m. on AM 950 KPRC. Successful Living with Bill Knapik. Go to radiobill.net for more info.